All right, perfect. Thank you guys very much for joining us for our 2024 the Society of Scholars of Zoroastrianism's academic lectures. My name is Zal Eric Talyarkhan, and I'm the current president of this organization. The Society of Scholars of Zoroastrianism is an organization focused on providing a platform to universities, students, and professionals in the field of conducting research on topics that build the archive of knowledge and history pertaining to that of Zoroastrianism. This platform has been specifically created for intellectuals such as yourselves who are invested or are intending to take on a career in academia, with a focus on empirical research of said Zoroastrian history, to share your research, your papers, your thesis projects, and other new discoveries amongst your peers. We, the directors of this endeavor, are committed to investing our time to build this platform, and this lecture series is one of our many firsts. We want to create this platform for it to be accessible to you, the student, the professor, the field researcher, an internal news feed of sorts, for it to be accessible to you, and specifically on topics that pertain to Zoroastrianism and its further study. Our endeavor is to be able to be a resource for your research in allowing you to tap into our network of professors and students from all over the world in the fields of academia pertaining to Zoroastrianism. Theologians and Zoroastrian priests will be able to showcase their published work for both past and present research endeavors. We are working on building out our website, which is s-s-z.org, and connecting with you all to work with you to showcase your academic works, dissertations, and achievements. Our goal is to further academic research and study and to encourage the next generation of scholars to advance that said research. I would like to thank all our directors, Mr. Roynton Ravetna, Ms. Pervin Rusi Talyarkhan, Professor Nasher Contractor, Mr. Maria Ravetna, and Mr. Kersi Shroff for working together to make this event come to life. I would like to thank the Zoroastrian Association of Chicago. Can we please mute everybody else? I'd like to make sure that the speakers are also respected while this is taking place. Thank you. All right. So we have some amazing speakers on the docket today representing all walks of life. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please put it in the chat box with the name of the professor you are directing this question to. And with that, I'd like to introduce our Masters of Ceremonies, Dr. Janet Kestenberg. And now, Janet, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Muted, we cannot hear her.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased that we can all get together here, albeit on Zoom. And I do want to then introduce myself. First of all, I am a retired professor of anthropology and a of social and cultural history of Zoroastrians of Iran in contemporary times. So to some degree, I am here under false pretenses because I am not a scholar of Zoroastrianism. I also would like to thank Bahman Muradian of Toronto, Canada, a scholar of Zoroastrianism and a community activist, my frequent collaborator, for his input in this discussion, which I will initiate in a moment, of reformists and traditionalists from the Zoroastrians of Iran. Now, we have some feedback. Is everybody hearing it? Is there a way for us to remove it? Several authors at modern-day changes among Iranian Zoroastrians with a different foci, such as Herman Daruwala on priestly ritual changes, Heinz on early post-invasion changes, Ketayun Mazdapur, Bahman Muradian, Michael Strasberg, Stewart, Rose, Ringer, Nietzsche, and several others. In other words, there is a quite large number of people who are studying contemporary Zoroastrians, even though we mostly hear about ancient Zoroastrian history and scholars of Zoroastrianism as a religion. Today, I would like to focus specifically on the interrelationship of reformists and traditionalists among Iranian Zoroastrians since the 1970s. As part of this discussion, I want to question the usual positioning of tradition and reform as polar opposites. As Jacques Derrida argued, binary oppositions are generally untenable, even though our language encourages us to think this way. We say young, old, rural, urban, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily believe that there is nothing in between, but it does encourage us to think in this bipolar way. If we look at commonly used definitions of these terms, they too encourage binary thinking. Tradition is often thought of as a collective practice or system of beliefs which have considerable historical continuity. Traditionalists are then those who tend to look back to history, scriptures, and rituals of their own upbringing as sources of religious authenticity. They tend to resist change. That is our view, our general view. Reformers are generally considered those who wish to make changes which are forward-looking, to adapt to current and future circumstances in accord with perceived values of modernity. Of late, reformers at times refer to the concept in Zoroastrianism of fresh garde, or in Old Avesta, fresho kariti, which has been translated as perfecting or freshening, and came to the forefront of Zoroastrian thought in Iran, especially after the 1920s. Fresh garde is used in the Gathas to mean making life excellent. For those of you who know Farsi, the word kard, to do, is derived from gard. So it is a verb, to make life excellent. It is also used as a noun to describe the perfect creation made by Ahura Mazda. This first stage, as described in the Bundahism, is the perfect stage created by Ahura Mazda. It is followed by a period when evil mixes in. In the third stage, a collaboration of humans, Seoshants, Ahura Mazda, and spiritual beings conquer evil, and thus perfection, Frashgard, is reformed. You may notice that the word reform can mean something that we are changing to make better, but it also can mean reform as in recreate or renovate, bring back again. But certainly the idea of struggling for a better future can legitimize and even celebrate righteous change, bringing the world closer to reforming perfection. The role of humans in this struggle is invoked in the famous Yasna 30.2 of the Gathas, with which many Zoroastrians are quite familiar. This is a translation by Pablo Vasquez. Listen with your ears for the highest truth. Consider them with illumined minds carefully, and decide each man and each woman personally between the two paths, good and evil. As some mobeds, such as Rostam Shahzadi and the Azargoshasps, have argued, even religious ordinance could be changed without necessarily affecting the essence of the Zoroastrian religion. Vasquez writes that Zoroastrianism, without sacrificing its essence, is exceedingly versatile, which has allowed it to survive all sorts of calamities over more than 3,000 years. Despite the neat distinctions that we often make between reformers and traditionalists, I would argue that contrary to the usual conceptions, in actual cases, reformers often invoke traditions, history, and sacred passages to support what they promote as most authentic. Likewise, traditionalists do not cling to all past practices, but rather let some die unmourned. Their choices are often, like those of reformers, impacted by modern values and material conditions of life. As we look at some examples, we will see how complex their relationships have been. Among the most quickly ended rituals in the 20th century were those of ritual purification in Iran. Although there was some opposition to the abandonment of purification rituals Sishur and Barashnome Noshabeh, this faded as material conditions became decisive. There was a severe shortage of proper white bulls and for obtaining nurang and ritual functionaries. Rituals for avoiding pollution have been slower to fade away, such as seclusion of menstruating women and deeming those who wash or carry corpses as polluted forever. Farangiz Yiganagi, the daughter of the prominent reformer Khosrow Shahrokh, told me that when she married into the prominent Yiganagi family in the 1930s, she was shocked that they still expected seclusion. Seclusion died out or was relaxed in most places in Iran by the 1950s, though vestiges remain. We still have menstrual taboos. However, body washers and corpse bearers continued to be deemed polluted and outcast until about 1980 in Yazd and Tehran. It was challenged most when the children in the lineage of body washers and body carriers refused to continue their inherited careers and instead sought upward mobility. In response, the Zoroastrian Anjuman of Tehran announced that they had no choice but to hire Muslims for these death-related tasks. There was a huge hue and cry. But this quieted down when the Anjuman offered Zoroastrians the alternative of washing the bodies of their family members themselves. Eventually, commercial funeral services became commonly used. This attitude about pollution has practically disappeared in the 20th century as a more egalitarian attitude developed in Iran post-revolution, and Zoroastrians were able to find better jobs. Material conditions led to compromises. An example of how the urbanizing environment weighed on both reformers and traditionalists is that of the formalization of Zoroastrian rituals. In the provinces and early Tehran for an Afri Nagan Gambar or Meragan, individual extended families and neighbors gathered and mingled in the courtyards while mobeds sat off to the side in a specially clean place, praying. In Tehran, small apartments and the ethos and structure of the cities led Zoroastrians to hold such rituals in the temple. People were sitting in rows, and the mobeds were sitting on the stage in front of the audience, but the people were still chatting and gossiping as they always used to do, etc. With more formalization in the 21st century, the audience is asked to rise when the mobeds enter, to attend to prayers, and emulate gestures made. We can label this as the great traditionalization of the religion. The leadership has also added elaborate programs for celebrations, poetry readings, children dancing in costumes, video displays, etc., increasing the formality, of course, entertainment value, and appeal of the ceremonies. These changes tended to please both reformers and traditionalists, who appreciated the greater respect given to clerics, greater formal legitimacy of the religion, and greater public interest. They were appreciated by most Zoroastrians. The flourishing of the Zoroastrian institutions and events can in part be attributed to the Islamization of Iran, a rise in discrimination during the first decades, and shutting down of secular entertainment brought partially assimilated Zoroastrians back into the community fold, seeking events in safe places. As a backlash to formalities, perhaps, arose a new rededication to the old-time religion and its informality, playing music, singing, marching through the alleys. Some urban residents now regularly go to the pilgrimages at shrines near Yazd, hold sofres, and head back to their home villages and towns to attend celebrations there. Thus, folk revivalism and formalism have co-evolved. These examples illustrate cases of collaboration and even integration among traditionalists and reformists. I would like to now give you two more contentious examples of the interaction of traditionalism and reformism in context. They will be one, the prohibition of animal sacrifice, and two, the approval of women of non-Mobed lineage to become Mobed Yars, assistant Mobeds. Condemnation of the once popular custom of animal sacrifice was recorded at least far back as the 17th century in Iran. Manakji Hateriya raised it again when in 1854 he arrived in Iran, sent by the Parsi Amelioration Society to help his co-religionists in Iran. He was appalled at the poverty and hardship suffered by Zoroastrians of that time, but also at several practices he observed and the decline of many rituals by this impoverished group. He was most disturbed when his co-religionists sacrificed a cow for the celebration of Jashn Meragan in Yazd. In response to his protests, people argued that sacrifice was a meritorious act. Manakji, unpersuaded, argued that animal sacrifice was not a Zoroastrian practice. Finally, he resorted to paying villagers not to sacrifice cows, along with a prominent Parsi. Since then, the practice of animal sacrifice has diminished, but has not entirely died out. In 1971, when I arrived in Kerman, Iran with my husband Jamshid, his Zoroastrian family had brought 2 lambs into their courtyard. For 2 days, I innocently fed and petted them, and then they were sacrificed in thanks for Jamshid's homecoming and became our dinner, the remainder given to poor members of the community, Muslim and Zoroastrian. At the time, my parents-in-law had an inkling of disapproval by the Mobed Council in Tehran, but it was not of me were interested in giving what was to them proper thanks. In Tehran, where herds of sheep were no longer brought down the street to be purchased, such sacrifices naturally became less common. However, when I was in Iran in 2015, the Zoroastrian driver of a Zoroastrian school, who had just avoided a serious accident, asked the principal if he could sacrifice a chicken in thanks. The principal said, "We don't do sacrifices anymore, although clearly some people do, but you could hold a chicken dinner." Advocates of sacrifices are few today, but those who remain have referenced several Avestan passages, such as the Yashta Anahita 5:104, which talks about the evil ones offering sacrifices after sunset. But presumably it would be okay before sunset, or the Avestan hymn dedicated to Anahita, which involved the Shtaspa sacrificing 100 stallions, 1,000 bulls, and 10,000 sheep, Yasht 5.94. There is growing evidence also of sacrifices during Achaemenian and Sasanian times. Mary Boyce cited Yazdis in the 1960s saying, "People must kill to survive in this still imperfect world. And a blood sacrifice is most meritorious because it releases and thus protects the animal's soul. Furthermore, it is a good deed in providing meat for the poor and deserving." Those who have long sought a ban on animal sacrifice also turn to history, scriptures, and the essence of Zarathustra's message. Many Zoroastrians I spoke with mistakenly believe that animal sacrifice has only arisen under the influence of Islam and should be purged. Most Zoroastrians would agree that overall, from the Gathas to the later Vendidad, followers are urged to treat good animals kindly and without undue violence. They often mention Vahumana or Bahman, the Ameshaspanta guardian of beneficent animals described in the Haptang Hades. In his honor, Zoroastrians refrain from eating or killing an animal on days called Nabor, which means don't cut. In the final perfect world, there will be no killing whatsoever, they say. Thus, the sacred literature and practices can be cited to support or ban animal sacrifice. Richard Foltz has suggested that the modern rationalization of religion exposes such problematic, contradictory themes. But often it is not really the past or future which is determinative, but rather in poor areas, meat distribution, and in urban areas, preference for the theme of kindness to animals in the religion. Often, after bitter arguments, compromises result: a chicken dinner instead of a sacrifice, a rural mobed stepping aside to let a lay person sacrifice an animal. Okay, let's turn then to the second topic, the second example, the acceptance of female mobed yars. In 2009, Mobed Surushpur in Tehran came across a section in the Urbedistan describing women entering schools for mobeds and becoming mobeds during Sasanian times. In historical memory, wives of mobeds have even conducted the Barash Nom ceremony for women in Yazd. In any case, Surushpur brought the issue up to the Council of Mobeds in Tehran. He mentioned the problem of severe shortages of mobeds that the community faced. He argued further that scripturally, Zoroastrianism has always had a fairly egalitarian view of women. He pointed to Gothic verses such as Yasna 30.2 that calls men and women to choose their paths. And there are several places such as this, or Yasna 53.3, where Zarathustra speaks of the marriage of his daughter and her right to decide, to consult with your inner self and wisdom. Historically, we also see Achaemenian coins, seals, the Persepolis fortification tablets, which display women exercising considerable independence. Now, in order to anoint women as mobed yars, there are two traditions which must be broken. One is allowing members of the laity to become mobeds. There had long been village mobeds, demobeds, who had tended fires and helped with some ceremonies, but they were not formally educated and didn't pose any threat to the mobed's authority. The second rule that had to be broken was the formidable menstrual taboo. Up until the late 1950s, Zoroastrians had followed the Vendidad scriptures, suggesting that menstruating and postpartum women would be kept in small, dark punaguns. In the 21st century, a menstruating woman still would not work on a sedre or koshti or enter a holy place. Now people ask, would they touch sacred things on a regular basis? However, the majority of the Council of Mobeds in Tehran, taking a reformist position, prioritized Gothic gender equality perspectives and desperate need of mobeds over the Vendidad-based concern with pollution. By 2011, the Mobed Council of Tehran anointed 8 women who had passed the Mobed exams, comparable to what men passed, in an elaborate ceremony. Many Zoroastrians in Iran have since then come to gradually, though sometimes begrudgingly, accept what is now a fait accompli. Nonetheless, the male Mobeds have not relinquished all their power. Containing future power of Mobed Yars, they do not give them votes in the Mobed councils, in response to which Mobed Yars, male and females, have set up their own associations in Yazd and Tehran. Clearly, reformism and traditionalism have acted in a messy fashion here, involving power issues and shortages of Mobeds. The fear of menstrual pollution has also had a comfortable compromise, where menstruating Mobed and Mobed Yars recuse themselves from rituals. Thus, material needs are met for more clerics and pollution is warded off. In often contentious battles, both parties tend to bring scriptural and historical sources and passionless arguments to bear. Zoroastrians continue to confront the contradictory aspects of their traditions, finding compromises that tend to favor a more reformist position. Reformists tend to have more power than traditionalists, particularly since Arbab Give, and have often had on their side new material conditions that necessitate change. They can celebrate their victory as an ideological one, though often these changes are simply ways to use new methods to achieve old Zoroastrian goals. Mehrangiz Shahzadi, the daughter of Mobed Shahzadi, spoke at the elaborate ceremony, saying, what did she say? Oh, that this change was an example of fresh guard, a renovation which retains the essence of Zoroastrianism. And note, it is both a reform and a reformation of tradition going back to pre-Islamic times. One can see in the case of sacrifice, as in the case of female Mobed Yars, that the divisions between reformers and traditionalists is murky and complex. Multiple variables come into play, including the rural-urban divide, differences in class interests, material conditions, and the broader Iranian environment, leaving reform and tradition as one factor, not necessarily dominant. But we have also seen how much tradition is used in the service of reform to legitimatize change. And reforms are used in the service of tradition, for example, to preserve the purity of the earth by using tomb-like burials or heat-based cremation. Zoroastrians, no matter
Zal, we've lost Janet's voice.
The video is frozen.
Noshir, are you there?
Let me connect with them. They're gonna get back on. Apologies, everyone. I think they have some network issue, and it'll be resolved immediately. During this time, if you guys have any questions, based on what Dr. Janet has been talking about, please put it in the chat. I believe the last thing she was talking about was the divide in Zoroastrianism between traditionalists and reformists. all apologies, but I think the ZAC in Chicago is having Wi-Fi issues, but we have Professor Ted Good online. Ted, I believe you're already made co-host. I was wondering if you could
Yes.
just spotlight yourself and maybe start your presentation, and then we can take it from there.
Spotlight, that's it? Yeah.
Yep. You're center
Okay.
of my screen. Perfect. And then,
Cool. And then I have something to share.
yes, perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Ted Good.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. And so the first thing I should say is this is sort of a work in progress. And so there are points when I'll say this is something I'm working on. I don't know the answer. And I started working on this with a scholar named Gianfilippo Terribili, who's based in Rome. And so all the ideas are his and the pretty pictures are mine. That's how it works. Okay, and so Dankar 3, just as a little background, is a book written by Zoroastrian priests after the downfall of the Sasanians and during the rise of Islam. There's our context. Okay, so I want to start here. This is FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, which is a database for information on the US economy. And so here I have the rate of inflation in the United States. So you can see here it goes up, and then here it goes down, and then after a little ways, you can see it goes up again. So what is this? This is a part of something that economists call the business cycle, which is generally recurrent periods of expansion and contraction. There's some other stuff, but that's fine. And so basically it's a pattern of change over time, right? Because we have an up, and then at a later time, we have a down, then at a later time, we have an up. And one reason why this is important, or why governments track this, is that policymakers, but also us individuals, can respond to the pattern in the opposite way. So there are many ways to do this, but for example, when inflation goes up, the money supply can go down. And so when inflation is going down, the money supply can go up. So this is called counter-cyclical policy because it's going in the opposite direction. Okay, so this is the business cycle, which is basically a cyclical rise and fall for time. And there are counter-cyclical responses. Cool, right? Yes. And so I'm sure you're wondering, what does this have to do with history? Because that's what my presentation is about. But first we should say, how do we talk about history in Zoroastrianism? How do scholars talk about this? What are the topics or the ways that we group this subject? Well, one of the main things is we talk about something called cosmic history, which is like the story from the creation of the world until the end of the world. And one of the major events in cosmic history is Zarathustra getting the religion. And so in this story, there's things that lead up to this moment, and then there's the aftermath of this moment, right? In addition to cosmic history, we have something that scholars call national history, which features people like Jamshid, who's like an ancient king, or the Kayyanids, which is a dynasty. And so there are stories of Jamshid versus Dahog, who's his rival, or the Kayyanid dynasty versus the Turanians, which is another empire. And so various things about these. But one thing we should note about these are narrative histories, right? These are stories about characters relating to each other and things happening over time. So let's compress this into narrative history. When we talk about history in Zoroastrianism, we have narrative histories. But is there a theory of history? So not like a narrative of what happened, but a theory about how things happen, why things happen, or patterns in history or things like that. And so today I will talk to you about one pattern in history, which involves cycles and counter-cyclical ethics. So there are cycles in history, and we respond to them in different ways. And then we'll have a little conclusion at the end. Okay, so let's start with these cycles. So in Dankard 3, there's a lot of technical discussions, but the best place to start is after one of these technical discussions, there's this analogy, this metaphor, which makes it very clear. So this theory is like when night comes, so it's just become dark, and nocturnal birds, so nocturnal birds that like the darkness, they have an incline, they're going up. But at the same time, diurnal birds, so the birds that like the daytime, they have a decline, so they're going down. But then during the day, so that was night, now we're in daytime, it flips. The diurnal birds, the ones who like the daytime, have an up, and the nocturnal birds have a down. So this is our basic theory. We can sort of put it on a graph. Here's our cycle, right? Here's an up, here's a down. But because we're talking about day and night in this analogy, so we'll put the sun here, this is day. We'll put the moon here, that's night. And then here's our arbitrary break between them. So during the day, the birds that like the day have an incline, they're going up. And during the day, the nocturnal birds, the ones that don't like the day, go down. But then during the night, it's flipped. But if the nocturnal birds have an incline going up during the night, their graph should look different, right? The moon shouldn't be at the bottom, it should be at the top. So their graph would look like this. So if you're a nocturnal bird, that would be up and the sun would be down. I'm going to use this chart throughout the talk, but I'm always going to present it from the perspective of the diurnal birds. So the sun will be up and the moon will be down. Okay, so that's our intuitive way in. Let's look at something, or let's summarize. What do we have? So we have first this pattern of incline and decline, right? There's ups, there's downs. You know, the birds during the day go up, during the night go down. Second thing, we have two groups. So the two sets of birds, right? And each of the groups of birds reacts to the cycle in an opposite way. So when it's daytime, some birds like it and some birds don't. When it's nighttime, it flips. And one of the most important things is that this is mutually exclusive. It cannot be both day and night at the same time, which means both the groups cannot have an incline at the same time. When one group has an incline, the other group has to have a decline. So going up forces the other one down and forces, yeah. Okay, so yes, there's our theory. Here's a little more detailed version of it. This is not the metaphor. But first off, I want to point out, so this thing I put in curly brackets, this is like a really long and cumbersome phrase in the original language, which I'm compressing so it's like easier to read, but we will come back to this phrase later. But anytime you see this curly brackets, I've compressed it. Okay, so when people's good behavior, compressed, is general, so when people have this general trend of acting well, then the gods benefit physical beings, so beings in the world, so us. And the epoch, the time period we're living in, it increases in well-rule, so there's good government, good religion, so things are good, and knowledge, and many other things improve. But then on the opposite side, when people's bad behavior, compressed, right, is general, then instead of the gods, we have the demons. They come in and they, cause trouble. And at the same time, the epoch increases in tyranny, so bad government in contrast to the good government, and heresy, so bad religion in contrast to the good religion. Remember, these are the general trends. So when most people are acting good, or when most people are acting bad. Okay, so what do we see from this introduction to the cycles? We see that human action has an effect, right? Because when people act, or when the group of people act, they produce the general trend. And so if the group of people act well, they produce the good trend. If the people act poorly, they produce the bad trend. And that general trend produces the government, the kings, the religion, and then ... is a huge list of things. Okay, so let's come back to that phrase that I compressed. So what I compressed as good behavior is literally the back from vice and the forth to virtue. So it's kind of a strange way to phrase it. And then, as you would expect, bad behavior is the opposite. It's the flip. So it's the back from virtue and the forth to vice. So the meaning of this phrase is not immediately intuitive. It's sort of a weird way to talk. But I want to point out this. So we have back and forth, back and forth. This is the way they're talking. And this sort of way to describe behavior will come up again later. Okay, so this was historical cycles in the general perspective. The way people act on average defines the age and produces things like kingship and government and whatever. But what about individual behavior? If everybody is acting one way, does every individual person have to act in a similar way? So same chapter, now transitions to the individual. It says, during the general bad behavior, right? So we have our general trend. Most people are acting poorly in this compressed phrase. During this, in this context, when a particular person has good behavior, right? The compressed thing. So one person is acting counter to the cycle, then that one person gets the benefit. And that benefit is a pull to final victory, this being this sort of victory of good over evil, this sort of thing. And the benefit that goes to that one person is a benefit from the gods for the general populace. So it's sort of, even though one person is acting, it can have wider implications. And then, as you would expect, there is the opposite, the flip. During a trend of good behavior, so most people are acting well, there can be an individual, a single person who acts poorly. And that single person has a pull of evil and destruction. So instead of a pull towards the victory of good over evil, we have a pull towards destruction. And then instead of general benefit for the general people, we have fear coming to the general people. So this is the inverted negative aspect. So this is particular behavior, and it's using the same kind of weird phrase. To summarize, acting good results in a pull to salvation, general benefit, and bad as a pull to destruction. So these are like inverted parallels, right? We've been seeing this a lot. But also, this is another weird way to talk, right? We had back and forth, and now we have pull. The Dankard has like weird ways to speak about these things, but I'm pulling this one out again because the language of pulls will come up again later as well. Okay, so we know there's a general trend. So a historical cycle has a general trend. Most people are acting good, so the trend is good. It has these effects. But we know that individual people can respond differently. So if the general trend is bad, you are autonomous enough to act contrary to it in a counter way, in a good, and behave well. So that's what we have right now. But what exactly are you supposed to do if you are the individual acting contrary to the cycle? Well, okay, so you can respond in multiple ways. If you are that individual, you can respond countercyclically. So if the general trend is bad, you can act good, or you can act procyclically. Both these terms are from economics, so just like the introduction. Because if the general trend is good, then you would want to join them as well. So let's see. So if you're going against the grain, this would be countercyclical. And if you're going with the grain, this would be procyclical, right? So counter, pro. Remember, this is our motion, historical change. So now you have to decide, when is the right time? Am I living at a time where the general trend is good? Am I living at a time when the general trend is bad? Or like in terms of the analogy, is it daytime or is it nighttime? And then once you figure out the time, you have to ask, how do I act, right? Am I supposed to act the same way during the daytime as the nighttime? If I want to act good, can I just act in one specific way no matter what the context? Or is acting good context dependent? Well, here we go. Let's see what they say. So we see that the prudent person, so this like, wise, good person, has both forth and back virtues. So we have this front and back again. And the same person has wisdom, the psychological faculty, which leads these virtues. This is important because this person uses their wisdom to recognize what time it is, to recognize if they're at an incline or if they're at a decline. Because once you recognize what time it is, you have to behave differently. So, for example, if you use your wisdom and you determine you are living in an incline, then you will generally do the forth virtues and only occasionally do the back virtues, right? So during an incline, forth virtues. But if you use your wisdom and tell that you are living in a decline, then you want to do the opposite. You want to use your back virtues, but then only occasionally your forth virtues. So pattern is always, right? There's a flip, inverted flip. So we have good behavior. During an incline, forth. During a decline, back. So in order to act well, remember these are both virtues. In order to be virtuous, you need to shift your behavior according to the context, which means sometimes you will be pro-cyclical and sometimes you will be counter-cyclical to the historical pattern. This also means that forth and back are not the same thing as good and bad. They can be good if you use them at the right time, and they can be less good if you use them at the wrong time. Okay, so here's our chart, right? This would be pro-cyclical if the cycle is going this way, and this would be counter-cyclical, going against the grain. These are both good. This is like ethical behavior according to this prudent person. But you might be wondering, there's been lots of inverted patterns, right? Does that mean there's bad behavior, which is in the opposite direction, pointing towards the moon? Is this a thing? And of course it is. All my questions are rhetorical. So here's what it is. So we have forth pulling virtues. So both of those words, it's kind of a strange phrase. They have the character of warriors and lords. Back pulling virtues have the character of priests and subjects. These are the two good behaviors, right? And then the reverse, we have forth pulling vices. These are the bad things, has the character of tyrants. Tyrants being like bad kings, so the opposite of the lords, which is good kings. And then back pulling vices have the character of heretics, so bad priests, in contrast to the good priests for the virtues. So here we go. We have our chart of like how to behave. And this is based off of a traditional way to organize society, where there's a group of warrior kings and there's like religious officials. And both of those groups can be good or bad, depending on behavior. And so we see that here. There's two sort of kingly sets of virtues, sets of behaviors. The virtues, which go with good royal, and vices, which go with bad royal or tyrannical. And then with priests, or with religious figures, we have the priests, which are good, and the heretics, which are bad. And so let's put it on our chart. Here you are. You're using your wisdom to determine what time it is. You're living in an incline, which means you need to act like a king. Oh, but then maybe later, or something's happening, you use your wisdom and you determine that you're living in a decline. That means you need to switch and act like a priest. Because if you did not switch, you would be a tyrant. If you were doing forth virtues during a decline, that's tyrannical. But if you're doing back virtues during a incline, that's heretical. So I need to point out one small like philological point. So for these virtues, or virtues and vices, I translated the word vice in this section differently than earlier with the compressed passage, which was fourth to virtue back from vice. In the earlier section, it was bazak, which I translated as vice. But then here, with the fourth pulling and back pulling, the word is ahog. They're both contrasting with the same word for virtue, which is hunar. So if there's a subtle difference in what these terms are reflecting, I'm unsure what it is. This is one of the times I'm pointing to things I need to do in the future. But so I've simplified the translation and just translated both the terms as vice. Okay, so caveat aside. You're probably wondering, what are these specific things? Because if you have to act like a king, or if you have to act like a prince, what are you supposed to do? So Dankert 3 has dozens and dozens of lists, lots of characteristics. So I'll give you just a few. So royal virtues, this is good kingly virtues, great-mindedness, effort, which can also be diligence, and then open work. So you're not like doing backroom deals, everything's out in the open. But then for priests, so you're at a decline, right? You're, instead of great-minded, you're humble-minded. Instead of effort and diligence, you're content, which is more of a slow sort of behavior. Instead of open work, you have the ancient doctrine joined to open work. So I'm unclear on how this is actually related, but you can see that it's maybe a more religious take on this open activity. Okay, so what is the bad? Well, the fourth pulling vices. So if you're acting like a tyrant, you're arrogant. So instead of great-minded, you're arrogant, which is the bad version. Instead of being diligent, you're being greedy. Instead of having open work, you open dissimulation with as many grave sins as minor virtues, which is such a great phrase. Okay, so then the last one, the heretical vices. I should say there's one problem here. I've picked ones that line up, except for this last one, resentment. That one has to be, it doesn't match the open work pattern. So instead of, what was it? Humble-minded, indignation. Instead of contentment, we have laziness. These are contrasts that appear all the time. And then resentment. So these are sort of qualities of back-pulling vices, I guess. Yeah, counter-cyclical in a negative way. Okay, so there's our history. There's our reaction to it. What can we conclude from this? Well, first off, this is a theory of history, right? So it's more of an analysis of how history works, patterns, rises and falls, this sort of thing. It's not a narrative like most of the other things we've studied. It doesn't talk about a specific king. It doesn't talk about a specific event in history. It just talks about general trends. If everybody acts in a certain way, this will happen, etc. And so one thing that makes this interesting is this theory is more similar to a social science, which is why I compared it to economics, which is like a paradigm case of social science today. And then we can continue this in our summary, is that this tells us things about human behavior, right? Because human action is important, or as I said earlier, human behavior is determinative. What you do has an effect on like how history happens or how things behave, because your individual behavior or individual behaviors collect into general trends. General trends will result in good kings and good religion and this sort of other thing. But then there's one more thing. That means these general trends, which are composed of people behaving, the general trend is not something imposed upon you where you have to act that way. So there's no fatalism going on. Everything is just human action, and human action sort of feeding on itself and people responding to other people's behavior. So that's pretty neat. But then now we can make some corollaries and kind of speculate a little bit. We can actually tell when Dankert 3 was written based on this theory. So like I said at the beginning, Dankert 3 is a book written by priests, and it's a book written after the downfall of the Sasanians. So we have priests, we have a decline, we can put it on our chart. That means Dankert 3 was written equivalent or approximately here. You know, this is just a theory. This is one of the things that we can think about. Maybe this means the authors thought they were behaving in a certain way, and they view their time period in a certain way. Okay. And the very last thing, this project, this analysis of history, is part of what I think is the general theory of religion that's happening in Dankard 3. Because we had two groups, right? We had the diurnal birds, the birds in the daytime, and nocturnal birds, the birds of the nighttime. In general, the good group is called the Huden, or the people of the good religion, so Zoroastrians. And the bad group is called the Agden, people of the bad religion, or like irreligionists or something. But then, based on how the Agden is described, and based on when this book is written, this may be a theory about the rise of Islam, where the Sasanians are going down, this group of irreligionists are coming up. It's something I'm looking into, so this is the future. But thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you for
joining and for that presentation, and our apologies for having an internet breakdown of year at the ZAC. Why don't we go ahead and take questions for both Ted and also take questions for Janet, because the internet cut off right when she finished her talk, but we didn't get a chance to have questions for her. So let's open it up and have people put questions in the chat. I think that there are already some questions, and so maybe Ted, you could start by looking at some of the questions in the chat. Some of them have you already answered. There were questions about, for example, when was it written, and you just addressed that towards the end of your talk. But if there are others who want to ask their question orally, go ahead and raise your hand using the icon, and we'll try to do that as well. I see this, Karishma has raised her hand, but why don't we start with Ted? Are there any questions in the chat that you would like to address as you look at them?
Let's see. So there's a few questions from Karishma in the chat.
Okay.
There's one about the date. So I can say Dankard 3, in the date, it's something that begins before Islam and is completed maybe at the latest in the year 900-ish. So maybe like late Sasanian to the year 900. It's one of these books that was composed over a long period of time. More specifically, it's not clear, but it's clear that it's sort of layered.
Karishma, do you want to go ahead and ask your question as well? You
Yeah.
had your hand up a moment ago.
Yeah, Karishma?
Thank you very much, Noshir. Thank you, Professor Good. Having the actual word from Middle Persian that you translate into English would help immensely, particularly when it comes to key phrases like gods, where you quote the translation or the translator with a lower G, and an S apostrophe, so it is in plural. And it then goes with the word good, following that in line 66 of Dankard 3, if I remember the slide correctly. Could you possibly help us with that? And this would also apply to the concept of kingly, whether that had anything to do with the later concept or the Avestan concept of karena. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for the question. So yes, this is right. It's always good to have the original word to know like how is it being translated. So the word for demons is Dev or Devan, depending on the context. And for God and gods, it's Yazd for singular, and Yazdan was in this plural context.
So that's actually the word for to venerate, or that worthy of veneration, according to some scholars. So we are actually changing words through the translation. Or at least there is a change of translation and interpretation. Having the original is very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yes. Yes. Was that all the questions? I can't. Was that everything? I feel like
There's a question from Massimiliano.
let's see. Is that written? Let me see.
Question.
Yeah, I wrote.
Yes.
Hi, Ted.
Go ahead.
it was just a question about the Tenka third, because you said was written between the late Sasanian period and the 10th century. So, do you think it does not coincide with the Denka the 1000 chapter? Because with Denka the 1000 chapter, this red one written by Adufar in the 9th century, sorry. So the Denka 3, is it something broader than the Denka of the 1000 chapter, or just a part coincide with the Denka 1000 chapter?
Yes, okay. So for some background, Dankare 3 has hundreds of chapters, and the very last chapter is by one of the contributors to it, and he gives a history. He said, this person contributed to it, and then this person contributed to it. And then he says, and then I came and contributed to it and did X, Y, and Z. And at the end, he mentions this title, the Dankare of 1,000 chapters. And so this is
Wait.
Massimiliano's question. Sorry?
No.
And so in that passage, I think what the author is saying is that I think he's being humble, because he says, what I've done is a story, is a substitute. He says, this book is a substitute for that book of 1,000 chapters. And according to his history, the farthest thing he could point to is to Zarathustra himself. So I think it might be not.
Give me help.
I don't think it's a real book. I think it's either a way to say it's a big book, like The Thousand Nights, which didn't have 1,000 stories, or it's sort of a way to explain, because the story also says, like, in the beginning, this was the book, and then it was sort of destroyed and reconstituted. But when we remade it, it was a little bit less than the one before it. And so we had this one that was a little bit less, and then it also got destroyed, and then we remade it, and it was a little bit less. And so you can see over this history, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so he's at the end of the history, and I think he points back to the beginning. He says, this is not the original. So maybe that was good.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Kersi. Can you go ahead and ask your question?
Oh,
Go ahead, Kersi.
Yeah, for you.
can I go on?
Yes.
Yes, please. Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
I have written a lot about Dinka and Gathas, and this was something new to me about the cycle. I wrote about the diurnal circles that follows the sun, and it was published by University of North Carolina, that shows how the body follows the sun, and there is 2-degree difference between 2 p.m. and 2 a.m. Temperature in the body, etc., etc. But you have given me a completely different view that I had not had so far, and I have studied Zoroastrianism for how many years? 80 years. So I really appreciated it. But then everything you quoted Ditkert is really also surprisingly in consonance with the Gathas. The Gathas very clearly say that you have to really resist the evil. Those who are not resisting evil are evil themselves, it says very clearly, So all these are really in consonance and conformity with the Gathas. And I have just written something about Dinka third, and I have written a lot about Dinka, but it's all mostly about dualism. But there was not a word about dualism in yours. But again, it is dualism in the sense of fighting the wrongdoers, fighting the bad people. I think I lost you or what, but
No, I can hear you.
What's your question, Dad?
So my question is that Dinka third is not only just about dualism, but it's also about this thing that you pointed out, and that's something I have learned from you. I wasn't aware of it. That's all I would say, because I don't have to question anything. It's just an addition to my own knowledge. I just finished writing about Dinka Third, and I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. And yeah, Dankar 3 is very big, so it does talk more directly about dualism as well. I just talked about, what, 3 or 4 chapters, and in total it has 420 chapters. It is I think it's the single biggest book in Middle Persian that we have preserved. So there are some chapters that are directly analyzing Gothic concepts, so it quotes things in Avestan. But what I was talking about was not, it doesn't explicitly mention Gothic stuff, but it makes sense because these authors would consider everything in the Avestan tradition as extremely authoritative, and so they have to use it as a base. So yeah, I'm glad you liked it.
There are 3 chat questions, and then we also have a raised hand from Shmuel. Why don't we first start with the chat questions? And there are 3 of them that just came in. Kersi Shroff says, given your point on a layered approach to the Denkard, can it be then attributed to a chain of authors? Gallup Goodfellow, wasn't the Avesta claim to have 1,000 chapters? And could that influence the point here? And then Meher Master Moose says, how's the writing in the Denkard influenced by the downfall of the Sasanian Empire and religion of Ashur? Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. Take any of
Okay,
those.
so yeah, I'll start with the top.
Dave.
So Kersi Shroff. So yes, about the layers, it can be attributed to a chain of authors. And so that chapter that Massimiliano brought up, at the end of Dankar 3, it lists a bunch of named people. So it lists Adwar Farabai. He's in the early Islamic period. Adwar Farabai's son, Zardusht, and then this figure Adwar Bad, who was the last one who signs his name. From other sources, we have a few other names. So there's Roshan, the son of Adwar Farabai, who possibly contributed. He's not in this chain, so we don't know what he would have done. So this chapter at the very end, which explains the history of the book, says these explicit names. But the problem is that in the other 419 chapters, none of the content is tagged with a name. So we can't say, oh, this chapter was written by this person, this chapter was written by this person, or maybe this chapter was written by this person and revised, but we don't have layers that way. We just have this book, which is very big, very strangely written. So like, just like that phrase, forth to virtue and back from vice, that kind of weird language is everywhere. And we don't know, oh, is that one of the authors in the chain? And then maybe some of the other authors kind of revise the terminology. But yes, so there is a chain of authors and we know some of their names. Okay, so the next question, this was Caleb. So wasn't the Avesta claim to have 1,000 chapters? Could that be an influence? I don't know. Was the Avesta claim to have 1,000 chapters? I'm not sure. It could, I don't know, it could have been an influence. There are many things in Middle Persian that have 1,000 chapters or 1,000 something as like in the title. So there's the Book of 1,000 Judgments, which is like a legal book. And so it's 1,000 of this. And then there was the Middle Persian origin of the 1,001 Nights, which was called 1,000 Nights. I don't know if it's just a literary pattern or like what the source of it is. I'm not sure anybody's written on this sort of idea, but yeah, it could be something about the Avesta. That would make a lot of sense.
Caleb says Denkard
okay.
in the beginning. Just added another comment.
Okay.
We'll take one more question.
Okay.
You can answer Meher Master Moo's question, then we'll go to Shmuel And also,
Yes.
please raise your hands or post if you have any questions for Dr. Janet Kestenberger-Miki, because we didn't get a chance to have time for questions after her talk as well.
Okay, so Beher, yes, how is it influenced by the downfall of the Sasanians? We have so Denkard 3 is not really, it doesn't report a lot about history, so it's really hard to figure out when it was written. So we have this vague sense it was written over time. We have some references to like unnamed groups. They're just called people who have a doctrine, but they use a negative word for doctrine. So like people who think incorrectly, they're called the Keshtar. Sometimes we can sort of use other sources to say, okay, in this chapter or in this passage, when they say Keshtar, they're talking about Muslims. So in that sense, it's effective because they're responding to a post-Sasanian context where they're responding to people in the environment. There are no passages which say explicitly, like, or in the Denkard, there's no passages that talk about, maybe they don't name Islamic caliphs or things like that. In other texts, yes, Denkard 3 is kind of difficult to interpret that way.
Thank you. So we are running short on time, but Shmuel, why don't you go ahead and if you can keep the question brief and the response brief. We have about 5 minutes or so before we need to move to the next speaker. So Shmuel, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask you, what according to you origins of Zoroastrian idea of struggle between good and bad? Is it according to you the origins of the idea of good against bad in Judaism or very maybe in ancient Babylonian religions?
Oh, well, this is difficult to say. So first I'll say this is not something that can be answered by looking at the Denkard 3, because this is much later than Origins. I don't know. There's, the standard thing is that a lot of the sources for the early Zoroastrian period are not preserved, so we can't have the whole picture. And so I don't know. I don't have an answer for you about the origins of these things.
Okay, well, we have
Even
time.
short.
Thank you. Paulina, you're on next.
Thank you. So my question, hi, good to see you. So actually, this is question for Janet. So can I? Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting, your talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question, and great to see you. So actually, my question, so quite recently, someone reviewed my paper and pointed out that it's not relevant anymore to use the terms as liberals or reformists or orthodox to describe Zoroastrians. I don't necessarily agree, because I know that Zoroastrians themselves, they use those terms to describe their attitudes. But I'm curious, what do you think about it? And you clearly used the terms traditionalists and reformers in your talk today. So I'm curious, what do you think about this issue, and what was actually the source for your recognition of those two categories?
Well, everything really comes from what people said to me in Iran. So when I use a word like reform eslagar, and this is usually among the leadership and the mobeds and so on that use terms like that, whereas people themselves use less terminology to divide people, but they have a concept of a group of people who tend to take certain types of positions as opposed to opponents, or they'll talk about village. A lot of this is spoken as folk traditions, and anthropologists contrast folk and great traditions, which are sort of terms that have some degree of parallel to traditionalists and reformists. So if you're asking me why I use those terms, I use them because I think they come closest to what people talked about to me. So what is considered, more appropriate, that would be for people who are looking at it from a top level scholarly position, and I look at it from an anthropological position. Does that?
Thank you.
Thank you. We
I got
probably
frozen, but
go ahead.
I think it's frozen.
Why don't we go ahead and then thank you again. Is there one more final question for Dr. Janet Kessenberg-Amigi before we turn things over to Professor Miguel
Hello.
Toledo? Go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, I think Shirin has a question. Go ahead, Shirin.
Hi, thank you so much, Janet, for your incredible presentation. I was wondering, I think you were cut out before when you were talking about women mobilyars and the 8 women that have been recently assigned or ordained as mobilyars. Do you see in any of the futures that women could have more significant roles or more just socially acceptable roles in religious ceremonies and in traditions?
It's inevitable because of the shortages is a very strong factor, and also because women having taken the exams and passed this, as Mobeds did, have the degree of authority, and the Mobediyars who I've spoken to call themselves Mobeds. And they say we undertake all rituals that are done, even the inner yasna is under question whether it will be performed by these women. And you look at Kerman, for example, there's no Mobed in Kerman, there's a Mobed Yar. And he's a man, but he does all of the rituals that are necessary for a Mobed. So I think this change, be it for women or men, has already fait accompli, because there's just simply not the resources to go it without that. And there's also the background of the Iranian situation, where women are put into much more authoritative positions because of the shortages that they have. So it's a trend that moves in. One of the things that was very interesting to me, I didn't go through that, it's in my book, is how much the Iranian Revolution really led to revitalization of the Zoroastrian community. So when the government, for example, required that all religious institutions, all educational institutions give at least once a week instruction in religion, and when they specified the number of hours and exams and so on, this pushed the Zoroastrian community. We need more beds, we need more educators. We need to have better levels of instructions that became more symbolic, to be more befitting to a school curriculum. And so the students also are learning much more. I was on the phone with somebody in Iran, and he was saying to me, the kids are learning to memorize so much of the Avesta. And his 12-year-old son from the back said, "Baba, it's the gatas, Baba." So they are so, kids were becoming very, very much more involved in a way that didn't occur. It used to be 20% of the population had the Sedra Pushi initiation. Now it's probably 90%. So that's an important factor, and it moves to be more inclusive of women.
Thank you. That's very inspiring.
Thank you. So we are now ready to switch to, thank you again, both the speakers. Our next speaker is Professor Miguel Angel Andre Toledo, who's the Fazana Professor of Zoroastrian Language and Literatures in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilization. And I'm going to...
Jimmy.
unmute the microphone here and
Just don't worry. It's fine.
Huh?
It's fine. They're just.
Can I speak? Hello?
Noshir, you're actually on mute. We can't hear you.
So I just want to mention that we are trying to get our next speakers to share the screen. So we need to have him get co-host capabilities to do that. Maybe Erich can do that. But in the meantime, I also wanted to answer a question for those who may have missed a part of Dr. Janet's presentation. This session is being recorded, and so will be so that will be available later on for those who may have missed part of it. And now that we have shared slides, I'm going to hand things over to maybe Walter to take it from here.
No. Can you hear me first?
Yes, I can hear you
now.
now.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'm sharing my screen again.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Yeah. Perfect. So thank you very much. First, I will talk about the. Oh, sorry. Again. I will talk about the non-ritual Avestan fires, and paraphrasing a very important book, so-called The Fire Within, I decided to call the presentation The Fire Beyond, because, as you know, fire in Zoroastrianism is a very important element. It's a pure element with a special theological and ritual status in the Zoroastrian religion from its origin, but apart from its sacred character, and of course, its use in the ritual, we had also since antiquity, its use in the daily life. So we have also that fire is used in different daily life activities that, of course, might pollute it. So the problem is how to deal with its eventual contamination. That was a problem since antiquity, and a specific text in Avestan dealt with it. The young Avestan text of the Videvdat or Vendidat in the chapters 18 to 96 dealt with this problem, delve into that issue, and first we have to take into account that these texts were most probably composed in southern Central Asia during the first millennium before the Common Era. I will mention this right now because this is very important in dealing with the topic that I will mention in this presentation, in order to be able not only to analyze the non-ritual fires and the material culture linked to them, but also in order to be able to specify a little bit more the datation of these texts thanks to the data related to that material culture in these passages. As I mentioned, this text of the Videvdat contains specifics about Zarathustra's questions to Ahura Mazda about the spiritual reward for bringing to its right place in Avestan Daityagatu, literally right place, a fire that has been stained in different daily practices and professional activities. We have basically Zarathustra's question and Ahura Mazda's answer in a formulaic way in which each type of case talking about the decreasing impurity of each of these fire is mentioned, and Ahura Mazda answers to that. So the formula is basically in Avestan, yo atrem, whatever, daitingatum awi awa variety, whoever brings to the right place a fire, whatever, a specific type of fire, in which this X, again, repeats each of the 16 different cases of impurity to which the fire might be exposed. And starting from the most extreme case, which is the incineration of a corpse, and finishing by the least, which could be translated as literally the closest fire, but can be perhaps a hearth or even a brazier. We will see that later. The answer is Ahura Mazda's answer. The more the damage caused to this sacred element, the more the religious merit will be for whomever removes it from the source of impurity. Here we see the Avestan original, in transcription, of course, and my translation of the passage. I will not read, of course, the full translation, just the passage mentioning each of the specific fires. The beginning is, maker of the material creatures, righteous one, whoever brings to the right place a fire for cremation, which is Atrem Nasupakam in Avestan, how much will be the reward for this man after the separation of his bones and his spirit? And then you find the long answer. I will not read the full long answer in order not to make it too long because there are several passages, but first, a fire for cremation. Immediately after, a fire in which textiles have been soaked to be dyed. That's my interpretation of the term urusdipaken. Urusdipaken, as some scholars already wrote, is perhaps most probably connected to the root rot, which means literally to be red. Something that cooks whatever is red is most probably a way of saying a specific fire in which textiles are dyed and are soaked. Why is that such an impure fire? Because mordants or textiles need also urine. In antiquity, this type of mordant was mainly urine. So a fire in which something with urine is cooked, of course, is extremely impure. So it's the second after a fire for cremation, and it makes perfect sense with this interpretation. Immediately after, we have a word that is a little bit more difficult to interpret. I consider, among some other possibilities, but I try with this interpretation, a fire in which cream has been boiled or curdled, sairehiat. I will deal with this if you want later, but this is just a possible explanation of it. Immediately after, we have Atrem Humbat Hachazmaini Pachikat, which is a fire from a potter's kiln. That's much clear in the etymology, that's almost sure. Immediately after, we have Atrem Humbat Hachayamo Pachikat, which is a fire from a glass kiln, another daily life activity, in which, of course, fire is needed. Following it, Atrem Aoniat Hachaparo Berjat, which is most probably a fire from an oven to roast grain. The next passage includes a fire, Atrem, from a forge for smelting gold. Pisrat Hacha Zaranio Saepat. Immediately after, as we will see, there are other forging of different metals. First is gold. Immediately after, we have silver, Atrem Pisrat Hacha Erzato Saipat, a fire from a forge for smelting silver. After that, the problematic term, which in Avestan would be ayah, which in this compound, ayo Saipat, would be from a forge, Pisrat, for smelting either bronze or iron. Why I translate here either bronze or iron? Because we are not totally sure that the Avestan word ayah meant bronze or iron. We are not sure. So just I leave it open because it's just one of the two possibilities. The next with the next metal, because it depends, they are of course listed in a row. We are not sure if, in this case, if we interpret the previous one as bronze, we might interpret this, the next one, as iron. But if we interpret the previous one as iron, then we should interpret this one, the passage 90, as steel. And it is literally a fire from a forge from smelting iron or steel. Atrem Pisrat Achahaus of Naino Saipahat. After that, and that's one of the most important terms as we will see immediately after, Atrem Tanurat, a fire from an oven. And this word is, as we will see, extremely important in this passage. Following it, Atrem Dishtat, which perhaps has to do with something that is piled, Dishtat, and it could be translated among some other possibilities, a fire from bonfire stones. So something in which you put whatever to use that fire, these bonfire stones. After that, Atrem Aoniat Hachatahriat. This word was mostly wrongly interpreted because it was linked to another possible etymology, but in my view, this is to be corrected. In most Avestan manuscripts, you have Tahiriat, and that was the origin of the misinterpretation. But I would propose Tahriat, that would be connected with Vedic Takra, which is buttermilk. And it makes also a lot of sense that in a fire from an oven for preparing buttermilk, you need, of course, this in a daily life activity, but it might be also polluted. So this is an important term too that would tell us a lot about of the material culture too, by the way. The next one would be Atrem, Pantat, Hacha, Stauro, Payat, which is a fire from a path frequented by cowherds. After that, Atrem, Skyriad, which is also problematic. It has some possible etymologies, but I would propose here a fire from a charcoal burner, which is one of the possibilities. And finally, the last one, Atrem Nazdishtat, which is very literally, if we translate from Avestan, from the nearest place. But what do they mean with the nearest or with the nearest place? Literally, it's from the nearest in Avestan. It might be the fire of a hearth, the one you have at home, or even the one you can put the closest, which is the one you would use in a brazier, actually. That's just a possibility, but would also make sense. But now, the industries and material culture mentioned in the Avestan text of the Videdat 8, 18 to 96, as we have seen, are actually compatible with archaeological remains of many different populations of ancient Central Asia. So it's not that the techniques that appear there are exclusive of the Avestan population. So that's not helping too much in locating or in making a more strict chronology of this passage, but because we don't have this information to be more specific, we have at least one thing that could help us, which is the term in Avestan tanur or tanura, which is a baking oven. And that might help establish a relative chronology, at least of this passage. As we know, a baking oven in archaeological sites was found in a lot of ancient cultures that go from Kenan Tepe in southern Turkey since the late Chalcolithic period, so the 4th millennium before the Common Era. We have it also in Kalibangan I in Rajasthan in India since the early Harappan period, from the 4th to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Also in southern Central Asia, for instance, among many other places in the citadel of Jarkutan in Uzbekistan, since the just first culture of early Iron Age, so basically 2nd millennium, almost beginning of the 1st, and so on. We have it in a lot of places. This is just a picture of one of the typical baking ovens you could find in many regions today. But what about this term tanur, tanura in neighboring languages? Because we have it. Actually, for Avestan, we have it in Old Babylonian in the word tinuru or tinurum, also tenuru, in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. In later Semitic languages related to Old Babylonian, like for instance in Old Aramaic, we have the word tanur. We have in Biblical Hebrew, in Arabic, tanur, in Jewish Aramaic, tanura, and so on and so on. And of course, in many modern languages that took it either from Iranian languages or from Semitic languages all over Central Asia, the Middle East, India, and so on. It's a very famous word. But the question is related to Avestan. Is Avestan tanura, baking oven, a long word from many of these languages? That was already proposed by several scholars, before me, of course. Spiegel, Darmestetter, thought, for instance, that it could be a Semitic loanword, so derived from a Semitic language. They didn't specify from which exactly, but according to them, it could be. Also, according to Geiger, either Semitic and Avestan language took that word from a so-called Uranian culture, which he mentioned as a Uranian culture in Central Asia unidentified, or Avestan took it from a Semitic language in pre-Median times, according to him, to Geiger. Let's check these possibilities and the problems related to each of them, or the possible solutions they might bring to the problem. The first is Old Babylonian Tinuru or Tenuru is attested in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, and that would be perhaps most probably too early for young Avestan. If it would be Old Avestan, that would not be a problem because Old Avestan is older. But for young Avestan, that's perhaps too old. And there is another problem apart from the chronological one, which is the geographical distance from Central Asia, because the Yankavestan speaking population was located in southern Central Asia. So it's a little bit far in order to have this long word. In the case of another Semitic language that attested in an old period, we have the case of Old Aramaic, Tanur, that attests the word in the Aramaic inscription of Hat-Yiti, found in Tel Fekheriye in Syria, also in another Aramaic inscription found in Bukhan in Azerbaijan, to be dated in the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, respectively. So the question is, can Old Aramaic Tanur be the source of Avestan Tanura? Old Aramaic, as we know, was attested in eastern regions during the first millennium before the Common Era, but did not reach the distant lands of southern Central Asia until the Achaemenid rule, and that's important. So until the 6th to the 4th centuries before the Common Era. Apart from some other inscriptions and some other attestations we have of that language in the region, Aramaic, as we know, is attested in the documents from ancient Bactria of the 4th century before the Common Era that were edited by Nabe and Professor Shaul Shaked. So is the source of Avestan Tanura, if the source of Avestan Tanura is Old Aramaic Tanur, this word may have entered the Yankavestan language in southern Central Asia during Achaemenid times, and therefore would help a lot dating the Videbda passage we are dealing with to that period. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. And we now have some time for questions, either through the chat, or we can just raise your hands and we can take the questions from there.
My question is...
There is that's true. Baking, sorry, should be baking without the C, that's true. Thank you, Firdosh.
My question is, if this was during the Achaemenid period...
Are there other questions there?
Any question?
My question is, if Tanur was introduced into Avesta into Achaemenid period, would it be in the later Achaemenid period?
Yeah, that started well.
Because Videbda was more likely written in the later.
We come from different centuries. So my thinking is that I know the word Tanur is one that Zoroastrians use all the time. As far as I've seen, there isn't a concern about, well, I should also say that the ceremony of Atesh Bozor Kardan in Yaz, this one that is of cleansing the fire, in Kerman they don't do it, they don't even they haven't heard about it. But even Yazdis who live in Kerman, who have some of that knowledge, I've never heard or seen people to
ask if they can hear you.
And free of contaminants their kitchen fires. In the past, I understand there was more of that, but have you any information about how change occurred in the attitude towards the non-ritual fire in later times?
In my view, it would depend, of course, on the uses and the techniques in which you use fire, because depending, of course, on the social changes, fire would be used in different contexts and, of course, with different precautions. If we have to take into account that in antiquity, the precautions could be, of course, less, the fire could be exposed much more exposed to certain contaminations that it can be in modern days, so to say. So that might have been one of the changes. For instance, some of the techniques that are found, some of the ancient industries, either are continued with different processes or they are no longer continued in the standard ways, in the traditional ways. So they are more like, let's say, in factories or things like that. So the fire is not locally exposed in a small community, it's exposed, of course, in a wider frame. But probably that might cause also adaptations and changes in the rituals and, of course, in the daily life customs, say. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question. We have a raised hand here from Kersiantia, and we'll also have a question on the chat from Mayor Master Moose. What is the basis of your method used for dating texts and words?
Well, basically, not mine. The one in all the field, I would say, is basically historical and comparative linguistics, because when we are dealing with languages that are related, the first thing we need to know is the historical and comparative method. Thanks to the comparative method and the historical comparison too, we can reach certain conclusions about the relative chronology of most of the texts, because of things that, of course, would be a little bit more complex to explain, like, for instance, the preservation of certain ancient consonants and the development of these consonants in certain groups in different stages of the languages. We can have relative chronologies of the different stages of these languages. So, for instance, when we have a specific linguistic development in Old Avestan that is no longer found in Young Avestan, or is no longer found in Old Persian, or no longer found in Pahlavi, and so on, we can have strata levels of chronology. And of course, the comparison with neighboring languages, like, for instance, Greek and ancient Greek and many other languages related to the same group, of course, we can reach certain conclusions. Not always extremely precise, of course, not as precise as we would love to, but at least consistent enough in order to have this kind of wider frame. So,
great, thank you. So we have a question from Iris Colditz, but let's go first to Kersi.
Yes, I have one.
Kersi, go ahead and ask your question, comment, as the case may be.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. My question is.
I'm not able to hear Kersi. Do you have a question, Kersi? I see your hand is up.
Yes. Yeah. Can you hear him?
We're not able to hear you.
Mike,
can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, why don't we go ahead and
my
field the question from Iris Colditz.
Yep. Was
so
introduced.
He wrote, there is no if there is no cognate of Tanura in other ancient languages, that could be a long word. Not that I know. I don't know of any cognate of Tanura in Vedic or in any ancient Indo-European language. I mean, I might be wrong, but it's nothing I remember. So I think from Avestan, we don't have it in any other ancient Indo-European language. So that's why I assume that it could be a long word. But again,
I think the problem for Cassie is not that we didn't have our audio on. So let me turn audio on. And you want to turn your...
Now try.
My question is, usually Vandidat is supposed to have been compiled during Seleucid times or early Parthian times, and sometimes, of course, late Achaemenid time. What is your opinion? Do you ascribe Vandidat compilation during the Achaemenid time? And if it is, I think it will be only in the later Achaemenid times, with early period. I don't think the Vandidat kind of thinking is so present in the Achaemenid history and whatever information we have about them. So I want your opinion about when was Vandidat compiled?
Can you hear me now? Oh, sorry.
Touch the screen.
Yeah. When was Vandidat compiled? Was it in the later Achaemenid time, Seleucid times, or early Parthian times?
You're on mute and we can't hear you.
Yeah, now I can, sorry. That we, in some cases, like in this very specific passage, can have a kind of relative chronology doesn't mean that we have to apply to all the rest of the Videdat or the Vendidat exactly the same chronology, because that's in some cases it could be possible, in some others perhaps not. We know, for instance, that even in the Videdat, we have a lot of very old formulas that go back to ancient Indo-Iranian poetry, and in some cases even ancient Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European. So that we have a very late chronology for these things could be, why not? I mean, but I'm not very happy with this because, again, there are some linguistic criteria. There are the use of some poetic formulas that go back to much older periods that would disagree with this type of procedure. And in some other cases, if it is the oldest stage of the Achaemenid period, if it is later stage of the Achaemenid period, we just don't know. But of course, we know that certain practices that are described in the Videdat are attested also in neighboring literatures. So for instance, in Herodotus, in some other Greek authors, we have them attested. So it's problematic to say, okay, they are very, very late. In some cases, they might be later, approximately late, but in some others, not necessarily. So I think we have to be careful with ascribing a full chronology to absolutely all the texts. That could be problematic.
Great. Okay, so we should probably hand things up to the next speaker. I don't see any more questions here. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Toledo.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Shall I start? Well, hello, everyone. I'm Jesse Palsetia from the University of Guelph, where I'm professor of Indian history. I wanted to talk to you today about some trends in Parsi historical writing. So I'd like to sort of drag you away from Iran eastward to India, if you don't mind. And I want to look at, I entitled my talk today, Parsi historical writing from the pages of the Parsi Prakash to Parsiana, Tropes and Truths. Just to tell you my latest project, I'm working on a annotated and edited English language version of the Parsi Prakash, along with a graduate student from the University of London, SOAS, Ruzbe Hodiwala. It's a great task, and it was first started, the translation of the Parsi Prakash from 19th century Gujarati to English through the auspices of Professor John Hinnells and Dasturji Jamas Asa. And nothing had happened, though they had managed to translate a great many volumes. And after Professor Hinnell's passing, I was asked to look at some of his remaining works and possibly translate these writings. And from this, I'd like to give you a general impression of Parsi writing. In the 19th century, the leading historian of the Parsis, Dosabai Ramji Karaka, noted that the Parsis, it may said, are well launched on the path of progress. They have risen from poverty and oppression to security and wealth. It has developed in their race those high qualities which history attributes to their early ancestors. And Dosabai Ramji was interesting as he sort of set the standard for what would be modern history writing on the Parsis by both Parsis and at times non-Parsis. And in his work is a sort of theme or trope, I suggest, of the accomplished Parsi. And Parsi history is a record of unique triumphs that pervades Parsi writing. A sort of Whiggish history, as modern historians would say, of essentially the Parsis rising in prominence and their history as the sort of tally of these great accomplishments. And generations of historians would follow this pattern or theme, including modern Western academic historians. Sorry. This trope of accomplishment serves very important historical purposes, and that's why in some ways it was utilized. One, it is history writing both describes the situation of the Parsis and serves to highlight the relevancy of this very small community to itself and the outside world, in a sense preserving that community. At the same time, such historical writing can obscure other realities or truths of Parsi history. And this is really the point I wanted to make about writing today on the Parsis and what sources we may look to for that other truth. Indeed, from the earliest of times, the earliest of documents we have on the Parsis in India also begin this pattern of noting the uniqueness and accomplishments of the Parsis. There are two principal works that many of you may be familiar with. One is the 16 Sanskrit shlokas, and the other the Kisei Sanjan, which essentially tells the story of the exodus of the Zoroastrians of Iran and their arrival and settlement in India. The shlokas in particular set the terms by which the Parsis were accepted in India. Many of you may know from that story that the Parsis arrive on the west coast of India and they go to the court of the local Hindu Raja, Jadirana, as he is identified, and essentially they're made to explicate their religion and customs, and they do so. And in return, the Raja gives them safe domicile in India. The Kisei Sanjan also goes into this, detailing more their exodus and their arrival. And these two works principally set the early Parsi history in India. And this too is a work that essentially sets to explain what their history will become. These works are written in the medieval period, around 1599 and a little bit earlier, and both essentially serve both historical and non-historical purposes. They essentially set out that the Parsis are a distinct group with their own religion and customs. And they also established that they are a peaceful group that are complementary to the social milieu of India. Both narratives suggest also this Parsi ability or agency to shape their circumstances. The earliest of Parsi writings indeed suggest that there is something historical at work here, that there is an internal imperative at play among the Parsis that make them want to come back to their accomplishments. The Parsis develop and foster this acute sense of their minority situation in India. And this minority situation conditions their response to safeguard community interests and group identity essentially under all circumstances. At the same time, the actual history of the Parsis was also shaped by external factors and circumstances not altogether in the Parsis' control. And this is what has been often neglected from the standard histories. External factors would prove both advantageous and the opposite for the Parsis. Of course, one of the most important of external factors was the fact that the Parsis came to India, came to a culture and a social milieu that essentially left them alone to form their community without demanding very much from them. This permits the Parsis to safeguard their religious identity and shape their institutions in India. They indeed go beyond simply retaining identity or safeguarding it to indeed elaborating on it, such as the creation of the fire temples across India. And not only that, but the elaboration of the ceremony of the fire to enthrone the fire in this grand censer. This is something quite unusual, I think, from the past, where you had the plinth fire and the like. So this opportunity of coming to India had unforeseen consequences, which the Parsis took advantage of. All of their religious institutions took shape in India, including the most unusual of sites in India of the Dakma and the Dakmashini taking shape in the Mofussil of Western India, and of course in central Bombay too. And perhaps the most consequential of external factors that would weigh upon the Parsis in the caste milieu of India is their adoption of endogamy or marriage within the community. endogamy. In a sense, the Parsis could represent themselves as one large community in India, not part of the caste system, not having caste amongst them, but essentially fitting nicely within the caste system of India, alongside the other Indian communities. At the same time, the pressures on the Parsis were also great, and this is often forgotten in the history of the Parsis of India. Assimilation was very great. They no longer used their Iranian language, their Iranian clothes. They adopted Gujarati of Western India and a variant of it. And essentially, their customs became very much that of an Indian community. All of the loss of these things, and including for some Parsis to convert away from Zoroastrianism to Hinduism and other religions. This quantitative loss is unknown to us. How many Parsis of the medieval period indeed turned to religions other than Zoroastrianism or converted away from Zoroastrianism? Of course, the most consequential historical factor, or one of them certainly, was the arrival of the Europeans and the Parsis' association with the British. Various factors I've written shape Parsi-British relations and what we call collaboration. But Parsis go from an obscure local community to in Western India, a very prominent one, and indeed some would call it a colonial elite. This trope of success really emerges as writing emphasizes this. There has always been this sort of trope of the preservation and success, but the 19th century really shapes this further in the historical writing. The great Parsi names and families emerge of the Manaks, Nanabais, Dorabjis, Patels, Banajis, Modis, Wadias, and Jiji boys. And these individuals go from obscure traders to merchant princes, the great Parsi Shetias and community leaders. So you have a rise of a leadership, a rise of prominent family names. You have the Parsis become one of the most westernized and educated of communities and modernist of communities, for they also begin the education of women. And if you read some of the arguments for the education of women, you'd think they came right from J.S. Mill himself. From the 1830s, Parsi boys and girls' schools take shape, creating an educated, westernized, Anglophile group. And much of the history of the Parsis really celebrates represents this history. It reinforces this history. H.D. Darukhanawala's Parsi luster on Indian soil, and G.A. Nathason's the famous Parsis. Contemporaneous with this literature is also the work I'm editing and annotating today, which is the Parsi Prakash, a voluminous set of writings begun by Bomanji Biramji Patel, taken on later by R.B. Paymaster. And this is a compilation of extraordinary details of the Parsis in Bombay and Western India. It really reflects how extraordinarily educated were the individuals who compiled these tracts, for their clearly newspaper reading, report reading, and even some, I would call it archival research to note down many of the details of the Parsis' existence in India. But this too is missing a certain level of modern Parsi academic analysis, which is to look beyond the pronounced individuals, the great individuals, to what is the actual, in a sense, social history of the Parsis. Their literature, their historical literature, can very much obscure more mundane existence and motivations that the Parsis had. When one goes to the archives, which is really the only place one might find details, and of course the archives contain aspects on all communities, It is only here that you get the sort of real social history of the Parsis, of their arguments with each other, of marital disputes. You'll be astonished to know how many Parsi wives end up at the bottom of wells rather than have their husbands divorce them. These sorts of things emerge from these pages that the actual textual published histories don't give you a sense of. And the Parsis' rise to prominence, too, as a historian of India, I would suggest, was not particularly unique among enterprising Indians. It is just that at a certain point, the Parsis formed connections with Western groups that were before many other groups could also. And the motivations of Parsis are important too. Almost all of the grand figures that come out of Parsi history are benevolent, are philanthropic, are enterprising, are insightful. And all of those traits are there and laudable. But there were also very human motivations. I spent the last 15 years writing my book on Jamsetji Jijiboy. He was a premier philanthropist. He became the first Indian knight in 1842 and a hereditary baronet in 1857 under Queen Victoria. He began in a very modest way. His is a true rags to riches story, where he went from essentially collecting and selling bottles, Batliwala, to this great trader, what is called transshipment between China trader. He sold goods from India to China. And one of those things that he sold was also opium. The history of the Jijiboys and other Parsis' involvement in the opium trade was very much obscured for a very long time. And by their involvement in opium, I don't place any moral judgment on that. I don't believe history should be subject to those sorts of moral judgments. I simply mean that he engaged in it is a reality that should be brought out by history. And it wasn't until very recently when his papers were released to the public. Even in his own lifetime, Jamsetji tried to craft an image of himself, a very crafty image of himself in the memorandum of the life and charities of public charities of Jamsetji Jijiboy in 1855, written by Williamson Ramsay. This document essentially downplays all of his opium trading. He is known as a great China trader, but not necessarily an opium trader. So he, by this time, was also feeling the growing sort of what would be a moral reaction and opprobrium against the trade. And in favor of his charities being put forward in this document. In fact, this document was a sort of propaganda document which the Jijiboy family, particularly Jamsetji's son, Kursitji Jamsetji Jijiboy, wanted to put out so as to favor his father's attainment of hereditary baronetcy. So these were multiple motivations. One was a self-motivation to propel one's place in colonial society. Two, there was this case of him providing for the Parsis and then also to the larger community. Jamsetji Jijiboy, among many Parsis, was a great philanthropist. And philanthropy was a way that Indian elites or Indians could make themselves known to the imperial system, to court favor, to engage in humanitarian and other acts that the British would find laudable, building hospitals, giving charity, being public spirited. And Jamsetji Jijiboy did all of these. Indeed, a great sort of marker of not just him, but of the Parsis themselves becomes their charitableness. There's an old saying, Parsi, thy name is a charity. Indeed, M.K. Gandhi, he once said this himself. And there are also the idea that there is no Parsi suffers of want, given the level of network and charity that there is there. But this obscures also the fact that charity and philanthropy are there because there is poverty and including Parsi poverty. Rarely do the 19th century tracts speak of the level of dependency among the Parsis and the like. And even when it comes to something like the nationalist period, Parsi tracts will laud the fact that many Parsis were pioneers of Indian nationalism, this first wave of Indian nationalism, including, of course, the grand old man of India, Dadabhai Naoroji, and many others like Firoz Shah Mehta, Din Shah Wacha. They were early founders of the Congress, and they shaped the Congress's a political culture towards a peaceful constitutional protest. But this too obscures the fact that in many respects, the vast majority of Parsis were ambivalent to Indian nationalism, that they did not see it as in their interests, and the continuation of imperialism was their goal. Nevertheless, true to the pattern of pioneering change and the like, Parsi tracts and readings will very much stress the Parsis as a central feature of the birth of Indian nationalism. And this brings me, in a sense, to post-colonial period. After independence, a new sort of literature also emerges amongst the Parsis and academics, interestingly enough. The theme or trope of sort of loss, of decline, or even a decay. Perhaps best symbolized in Tanya Luhrmann's book, The Good Parsi, in 1996, which many people regarded almost as a sort of slander, for she essentially highlighted all of the aspects of the Parsi community that are negative, and I won't go into all of them here. To some degree, this sort of writing too, while it is from an existing historian or anthropologist, also falls into a sort of trope of overstating the reality, and that is why it was not welcomed so much, as well as that it went against the traditional narrative of accomplishment. What is the reality of the Parsis post-independence? One clearly of Parsi competition with other Indian communities. That was there to some degree in the past, while the Parsis were ahead of the trend in education and other things of the other communities. They could be prospering. But once the equality of all Indians come into play, once the state must look after all the interests of India, then Parsis face tremendous competition and challenges. And indeed, from 1947 onwards, Parsi history has stressed more the levels of poverty, dependency, and illness defining the Parsis. So we've gone, in a sense, from one extreme to some degree another. One of the most interesting writings to emerge in the post-colonial period is the magazine Parsiana. Parsiana began in 1964 under Pestanji Warden, and later continued for a long time under Jahangir Patel. And Parsiana was a very interesting thing, for it combined clearly noting the accomplishments of the Parsis, animating their history to generations who didn't read Karaka and others, but also very much taking an eye on what is happening in the community today. The quarrels, the controversies, all were there in the pages of Parsiana. And to some degree, this upset many Parsis too, for they had never been exposed to the reality of all aspects of their history writing. They had been spoon-fed and other-fed in the great accomplishments. And the actual history at times struck many. And now, of course, Parsis are totally habituated to controversy and the like. So I doubt anything that comes out now would scare the horses. And now, what is the state of current Parsi historical writing? Well, there is still that very much a strong idea of a nostalgia and commemoration of this community's accomplishments, and for a different reason now, that it is, in a sense, seen as a dying community with lesser and lesser members in India, for sure. This decline of this community is real and tangible. We speak of the decline in the numbers of the Parsis. That is now a very old-fashioned lament. The real lament now is that there is nobody to take over the community housing and look after the great trusts that once catered to 79, 80,000 people in India. And now these places are going by the side, and pressures are upon the Parsis to give them up indeed to the larger Indian community. Many Parsi may well know that while some lived in charitable housing, now you can, and people often passed on their charitable housing to their children. Now one child could end up with 3 charitable units because there's no one to fill them of need outside of their family. So it's an extraordinary situation. And indeed, there are books that are trying to document all of this. Professor Amiji mentioned that there is a lot of scholarship on Zoroastrianism, and I would add on Parsi history too. A whole new generation of non-Parsis are entering the field, and that is both good, but it is also to very quickly document in the life of the Parsis their community for in 200 years, whether there is any Parsi around to provide for their history to scholars who are going to write about it. Is an uncertain thing, or certainly the Parsi that will be telling the academic student about their history will be a very different sort of Parsi, I suspect. So I just wanted to sort of touch on aspects of Parsi history, and also to suggest to people that it is not simply the history of accomplishment. It's a very real history where Parsis faced many challenges in rising in imperialism. Jamsetji Jijibhai faced many, many challenges to becoming that great man that he was, including racist and other obstacles. Nevertheless, he persevered. And that history is as important as the glorified history that sometimes we get in many books. Thanks very much for listening.
I'm going to go unmute.
Hello?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Sure.
We have a couple of questions. Thank you very much for that presentation. We have several questions that have been in the chat. The first one here I'm seeing was, I think, from Karishma, give a reference for the 16 slokas you mentioned about the agreement between Jari Rana and the Zoroastrians who arrived in Sanjan.
Yes,
Do you want to go ahead and field that question?
Sure. These are Gujarati writings, and you can find them, in fact, on the internet. But they were first translated in the 1870s. James Burgess wrote on them, the most original translation. H.D. Hodiwala wrote on them. So these are there. This is not the history of the sugar in the milk. That is a story that Parsis tell of how when the Parsi leaders came to the king, they asked for a vat of milk to be brought amongst them. And in that vat of milk, the leader of the Parsis put a pinch of sugar or a gold coin, suggesting how the Parsis would not disturb India, but add to its richness. That, in fact, is a story that comes really from a play on the Sanskrit shlokas. The shlokas are those that essentially tell us the etiology of the community in India. They are a thematic history that tell us aspects of what must have happened, but also a sort of thematic history, which is a nation-building story, how the Parsis come to be a people or nation in India. So you can look them up on the internet, and they will give you all of the individuals who have translated them, as well as translations of them.
There is also a question from in person from Rohinton Ruvetna. When did Parsi Prakash begin its publication, and when did it end?
Yes, it began in 1888 under B.B. Patel. It began in 1888. He he edited, I think, about 4 volumes or 5 volumes till 1910 when R.B. Paymaster took over. And I believe the last of them go pretty much to the 1930s. I have to check fully on that, but they go to the 1930s. I'm right now really doing the early ones, which are taking up my time. But it's an extraordinary panorama of this history. And it clearly shows that people were educated and following events and writing things down. If you're a historian of the Parsis, you can find in even some small footnote a sort of clue to where you might go in the archives to investigate this more. I wrote one of my first articles was on a famous riot that took place in Bombay in 1832, where the Parsis essentially led the community in shutting down the island because they protested the cull of stray dogs in Bombay. And that came from just a footnote in one of the books of the 19th century, which then I took to look it up in the archives, whether they had the archival materials on that. And fortunately, I found that. So it's extraordinary how insightful these people were to note down so many things which historians might go further with.
There are several more questions in the chat, and I'll let you, Jesse, look at them and decide which ones and how you want to answer them.
You know,
Sorry,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
And also, if there were anyone who wants to raise their hands virtually, you're welcome to do that as well. But we have plenty of questions, so have at it.
The portraits of Gigi Boy are many. I can't fully tell you how many offhand, but the most important representation of Jamsetji Gigi Boy was the marble statue that was created and placed in the Bombay Town Hall now. It's in a prominent place where you go down the steps. He is right at the top of these steps. A marble statue created by the very famous Baron Merocchetti and done in his London studios. Queen Victoria even went to look at it before it was shipped off to India. And this marble statue, which I have written about, was the first public honor that the Indians did to one of their own. The citizens of Bombay, that is, the leading citizens of Bombay, chipped in to create this statue by subscription. And it was to show that he had, that Indians had become sort of equals with the British in civic affairs in Bombay. And that statue was not only important because of that, it was also inside the town hall, where only British officials had been before. And of course, from that statue would be the great statues you see across Bombay of him and other Parsis too, and portraits too, engravings of. The Oriental Club in London, if you can get access to the interior, has one of the great portraits of Gigi Boy there. These serve as reminders to the Parsis, and certainly the public statues across Bombay, to the general public of the importance of the Parsis to the culture of Bombay. And And while many Indians today would not know exactly who these people are, the very fact that they have these statues of Indians still speak to the importance of their actions to India as a whole.
Great. There's also an in-person question from Manik. Do you want to go next? And then we can come back to some of the questions in the chat too.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead, Manik.
Unmuting myself. Yeah, I was wondering if Mr. Palsetia and others have seen there's a huge portrait of Jamsetji Jijibai inside one of the rooms in the Victoria Terminal Railway Station in Bombay or Mumbai. And I just happened to see that, with my daughter when I visited last time. And he was one of the two donors, who donated money for building that railway station. It's a huge railway station. The other donor was a Gujarati gentleman.
Absolutely, and the Parsis, in a sense, began this trend to give to civic projects, public projects, money as a way of sort of showing the British that they have a place in the running of their city. I write often that Jamsetji wanted to be a sort of partner with the British in public projects. That was his way and the community's way of coming close to the British and also having a say in the running of their cities. Now, this was not an easy thing. One of the first things he wanted to do was build a hospital, his famous Jijibai Hospital, and I looked at that. And while he wanted, the whole idea was that if the British were partners with Indians, not only would that elevate Indians to working with the British, but also it would give to Indian institutions that in the past had failed a sort of security that the British would be sort of trustees with the Indians on these committees, because he had seen how institutions, including the Panchayat, had filtered away, sort of ruined themselves because there was no accountability. And so he saw the imperial link as both good for him, Indians, and Indians in going forward. And these statues were sort of things that others did to also promote the image of Indians under imperialism.
Thank you.
Do you want
Just
to go back to the chat and
sure.
see questions? Yes.
Dear Rustomji is a very important one. I'll speak generally to archives. I've been at the archives since the early 90s, and things are changing. Things are getting electronic photography of them and things like that. But the archives are really in a poor state still. I was one of the last people to see the Parsi laws, and I microfilmed them then and made copies of them. And these are laws that the Parsis enacted for updating their community their laws on marriage and divorce and things. But the best place to go for research is actually state archives in Maharashtra, at Delhi. These are where you get the real history, but it's a lot of sifting. As I said, I was just astonished when I was looking at private files on lawsuits, how many, or criminal records, how many Parsi women were being thrown down wells. I mean, we can laugh at this now, but it was, murder by their husbands of their wives, which nobody hears about in the history of the Parsis, certainly, and I'm sure other communities might have done that too. We hear about the well that the Parsi establishes for the community and its religious aspect too, but not as the tunnel of death for women, etc. So the archives are the place to go to. And of course now the archives are not on the internet yet, But so many of the early primary sources that I had to climb upstairs on rickety stairs in dust-filled libraries in India are now on the internet. And there's so much there available to us, and that's a very good thing. But if there is money, the Parsi should also invest in supporting the state archives and national archives, because that's where you'll get the real history from.
Thank you. And Karishma, you have both a couple of questions also related to the archives and then reflection. Can I invite you to come on and summarize the chat, or we can also have Dr. Palsetia respond to the chat?
I can do this first. I'll
Go
give
ahead.
the question and then the response. So, Dr. Palsetia, thank you for your observations. Are the archives that you're using the work
Yes.
or the collection of John Inels by any chance?
The ones I'm translating, the ones I'm translating, or not translating, but annotating and editing, along with Rusbeh Hodiwala, these are some 20 years to 30 years ago. He had asked Jamas Asa to translate some of the volumes of the Parsi Prakash. This was largely for his private use because he didn't speak Gujarati or read it, to utilize in his research. And those were sort of lost for a time. He himself had forgotten where they had been. Others had thought that they had gone back to India with Jamas Asa. And so finally, it was only 2 summers ago that Rusbeh and I went through all of the files that were left after John Hinnell's passing, and we found these English notes of the translations. And so we are taking those now and going through them, how accurate they are in the Gujarati, as well as I want to annotate them to essentially add some context to what these compilations of facts are. They are available on the internet in Gujarati, many of the volumes of the Parsi Prakash, but not in an English translation, which I think would still be, for all of the electronic resources we have, a hard copy would be a great thing to have. And it would be in honor of John Hinnells, who's really the sort of dean of Parsi studies.
Yes, thank you very much. At the ZTF here in London, we are always very grateful to you researchers, including Rusbeh, and all of you here for the work you do on the archives.
And I wanted to say a real accommodation to Rusbeh, because he's working to the point where people will be able to then go to his notes are kept at the Ancient Iran and India Trust at Cambridge, and soon they will be made available to people who ask to see them. And it is largely his work, because I'm here in Canada, burdened with marking and lectures, whereas he's not only writing his PhD thesis, but also working at the AAIT.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Noshir, for inviting my reflection. My reflection is more a form of gratitude to the Institute of Zoroastrian Studies for bringing such fantastic speakers to us. Because what has emerged to me, at least from listening to all 4 talks today, is that it's more an emergent concept. So when we bring things together, either the qualities worthy of veneration, as was spoken about, the Yazdan, in the priests and in the kings, mentioned in the Denkard, or the ideas of purification in the Vandidad, or more specifically, the types of fires that come together in the installation of fire temples. Or as Professor Palsetia talked about, the idea of charity, which in the text is really Radha with Rasti. It's not just charity giving, it's correct giving with righteousness. That brings together the idea that in an agyari, a fire temple, it is 16 different types of fires together in order to create a fire temple, like that describes. So the importance of bringing together that from different sources that can make the best for the good of all comes back to the very first talk we heard today, frasho kereti, making wonderful. But in the Zoroastrian faith, it seems, at least to reinforce the idea in my head that it is everyone coming together, giving that which is best that they have, the fire from the oven, the fire from with different sources, the fire of the mind, to bring about a frasho. Of huge gratitude to the Institute of Zoroastrian Studies. Thank you all, speakers.
Thank you, Karishma. We have a little bit more time before we are going to turn to Dr. Karsiantia for concluding remarks in today's session. Are there questions for any of the speakers that anyone would have? Kersi has made a comment. Kersi Shroff has commented about also about archives in Kew in London and the Library of Congress in DC. And a question on early Parsi traders. Reference can be made to Jenny Rose's Boston to Bombay book. Yes. Behram, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
I want to make a comment, if I may. Picking up on what Karishma just said, and going back to the beginning of this session with Frasho Keriti, the concept of Fra, forward-looking, Asho, in righteousness, and Keriti, to do. That idea is, in my mind at least, what happens in the moment, now, in the present. Not in the past, not in the future, but now in the present. If we can live each moment of our lives in Frasho Keriti, then we create heaven on earth. The idea of the Gathas is to be happy. And how can we be happy is in our own control, in our own mind, in our own power. And if we make that effort, then Frasho Keriti is now and not in some future land or future time. So time is not a linear thing. It's now in the moment. That's all I wanted to say in terms of Frasho Keriti. And I wanted to thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity to come together, as Karishma just mentioned. So thank you all for your help.
Thank you. We have a comment from Shenaz Pujwala, hoping to hear more of Janet Kestenberg Amigi's talk if there is time. I think that the recording is probably the best way to have it. But if you want to make some recap remarks for those who may have missed the last part of your talk, you're certainly welcome to do that.
It's probably best to just look at my recording rather than to recap, because I don't know how much was cut off.
I also would add that a version of your talk will be given again this afternoon, and we will be streaming that on Zoom as well. And we have another session coming up, mostly in person, but with a Zoom access between 2 and 6:30 this afternoon. And I'll put the schedule up for that when we wrap up our session out here. Wanted to also mention that, let's see, there are some other comments. Yep. Why don't we, if Dr. Karsiantia is ready to come on and give us some closing comments, that would be terrific at this point. Not sure. Debbie, we are waiting for Dr. Karsiantia to join us. Behram has a question. In the meantime, Debbie asks, will the afternoon session be available on the same Zoom link? And the answer is yes, it will be available on the same Zoom link. Behram, you want to go ahead and ask your question while we wait for Kersi? Oh, Kersi's getting ready. So Behram, why don't you go first, and then we can hand things over to Dr. Karsiantia.
No, I think I'll let it go. Thank you all very much for organizing this event. It has been very inspiring. And I hope each one of us, wherever we live, can replicate what you are doing in Chicago.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I first want to take advantage of Dr. Palsetia's knowledge. I just have written lately a book about the Parsis' involvement in the opium trade. And I relied on a very nice book, perhaps the best book on the subject by an Indian writer. And instead of really denigrating or deriding the Parsis for their role in the opium trade. He says that everyone was involved at that time. I was surprised to find even Americans were so involved in the opium trade. I think it was like almost a thing to do, and Parsis were really involved into it, but they were also the first one to really alert everyone about the dangers of it. And the first one, of course, was Dalabai Nauroji. And I wonder, after reading that book, the writer doesn't say a word against the Parsis' involvement. Rather, he has chapters after chapters to say how the Parsis they invested all the money in developing India, and Indian industrialization would not have been possible without the opium wells that they had gotten, and they put it to good use. That's another example of putting your wells to good use. So I want Dr. Posetia's opinion about uh, any guilt feelings, any bad feelings, any bad opinions about Parsi's involvement in the opium trade, especially Gigi Bai, since he has written about him. And that's what I want to know before I go to my own thing.
Just very quickly, thank you, Kersi. In fact, you've hit the nail on the head many times. The opium trade was regarded by everyone, including Indians, Chinese, and Europeans, as just one trade like any other in the early 19th century. The prices of opium were quoted in the newspapers, all of that sort of thing. It was a matter of India has something China wants, China has something the British want, which is tea. And in this exchange is a perfect morality, of exchange, the morality of business. So in the early 19th century, there was no great opprobrium about selling what we would regard as a drug to someone to addict them, and nobody would have thought of Jamsetji Jijibai or any Parsi or anyone else as a drug dealer or trafficker, which are words we use today. And I think that is the way to see it, that you have to appreciate it for the history that was there. You mentioned that essentially the Parsis would get out of it quite quickly too. Once they saw the addiction, once addiction was understood, all of that sort of thing, which we know so much about now, which they didn't then Parsis did start getting out of it. Both for economic reasons and the moral ones. And they utilize, which is really the thing we should understand, that wealth from the opium and China trades to revive a new period in Bombay history of the cotton mills. The old Parsi China traders were the ones that gave the seed funds to the next generation to build the cotton mills, to build the manufacturing basis of Bombay and essentially Indian business too. So we should appreciate it for how they saw it then. But of course, for us today, the moral judgment is really not about history. It's about our society today, isn't it? That we wouldn't do that today, or we shouldn't do that today. But we can't apply that morality to the past. Otherwise, we'd all be going back to the countries we lived in and not coming to live in Canada or Chicago because the natives should have it, right? It's history. Remember it for the facts and the good and the bad, but that's different from how our morals are today.
I appreciate that, and I hope I can quote that. If you have written it down in writing, I would very much to have that to add to my own thesis. That's excellent. And I hope your whole lecture will inspire us to keep our own records and keep our own history as we are developing here. I hope it will inspire us. And thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed, I felt a little bit out of place with the other talks, but I learned so much today myself from those Iranian talks. It's just fascinating how scholarship can inspire so many things. And I want to talk to some of the speakers afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We have some comments here in chat that from Janet. Why didn't Jan go ahead and say it?
It hit me very clearly when you said our morals are so different today, because I mean, we can talk about years of selling tobacco and so many collaborating in it, and we can see the years of the opioid trade that is very recently with us. So I don't think our morals are that different than they were.
Hey, any other reactions to that? And then, of course, we should also let we still have some closing reflections from Dastur Karsiatia, but we also have a question from Manik Pojwala. Manik, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Dr. Kersiatia said and Dr. Palsedia said about the opium trade. I have read in the some place about the collaboration between Jewish businessmen and Parsi traders, and there was a big Jewish businessman who did this opium trade, and some Parsis became also partners with him. And this was the person who actually donated the Masina hospital, that he owned originally, to our Dr. Masina, as part of his friendship with him and all that kind of thing. So there was a lot of involvement of other communities in the opium trade. Thank you.
Can I ask Janet a question, which I'd like to relate to the Parsis of India, if she's there still, and that is, in some ways, you're putting forward a sort of formula for how do I say it, for reform and tradition to come together, and that's sort of what I would call the acceptance of change through solemnization of it, the solemnization of change, that essentially the Orthodox can make what is inevitable change legitimate and through their solemnization, so that both reformers and Orthodox have a place in where whatever Parsi tradition or something else goes in future. Would you have any thoughts on that?
I am embarrassed to say that between muting and unmuting and so on and so forth, I don't have a clear gist of your question.
Oh, sorry. I'll just summarize it very easily. That in some ways I was studying.
Can you mute your microphone?
Okay.
Can you mute your microphone?
I was just making a small observation that from your talk, I thought you were giving us almost a formula for the future, including for Parsis, that where reformers and Orthodox can come together is through essentially recognizing that change is happening, inevitable, that we do things today differently than our ancestors did, even if we're Orthodox, and that the best way to accommodate that change is through sort of the solemnization of it, to have the Orthodox have a place in sort of legitimizing that inevitable change, which reformers are whatever pushing forward.
Well, this was the fun thing about writing this piece that I kind of put together quickly, was that I learned to understand the interrelationships and interworkings of the people of very different ideologies, and to see how very much they all came together with the compromises and with the agreement. I think that's so important because the Zoroastrians in Iran are very fractious in their leadership, and yet it would always return back to what do we believe is the essence of Zoroastrianism, and that's something that all the groups really were able to agree upon in Iran, and the Fresher Karaite is something that legitimizes it. So even if you take an orthodox position, you have to recognize that this is part of the revitalization of the religion to make these positive changes.
Great. Okay. Do you want to respond to that?
No, I don't want to tread on difficult ground, but it seems to me the disagreements Parsis have over many things, while very heartfelt, can also be resolved through certain understandings that the Orthodox and Reformers both have a place in where Parsi tradition and religion goes. That there is a way always forward if people want to take it. And I've always said that the priests and Orthodox, they should be, in a sense, solemnizing change, accepting certain things which they can certainly, perhaps rejecting others, not rejecting everything. And that is a way of perhaps reviving the community. It depends on what your definition is. If a Parsi is a Parsi, and if one is the last one on earth, and we remain true to their faith, then that's your vision. But for most of us, it would be that we would like a community that is maybe different from the past, but still continues upholding aspects of tradition and religion, if in a different context, you know.
It's interesting that many of the early reformers in Iran were people who had gone to India, gotten educated in India during a period of Parsi reformism, come back to Iran and start spreading these ideas like Kehos Rosh Aroch and also Mobed. So you had Mobed Shahzadi, who was brought into Tehran because he was such a reformist. And thus you see even the Council of Mobeds, who would think that the Council of Mobeds was being a forum for reform, but it is. They're the ones who voted and said, let's go ahead with female Mobed Yars, even from the laity. So in the meantime, the Parsis in many ways disagree with the Iranian Zoroastrians, who are a product of the Parsi earlier influence.
And you know the difference in their situations, where in the 19th century the Parsis are prospering, and they don't feel the need to compromise on tradition or something, even though reform is taking shape, a school of reform. In Iran, it might be the sort of precariousness of their situation suggests they have to change. What do you think about that? I mean, where do you see, as an anthropologist, where the Indian community has gotten stuck on not wanting to change?
Well, I think that when the Zoroastrians were in the 19th century so oppressed, the predominant changes were to abandon rituals because they had no resources. But as with Parsi help and opening up of the trade economy, people had wealth and they were philanthropists, like the Jamshidian, particularly others well. And so that gave the resources, plus the Parsi influence, gave the resources for ideas about adapting to the new environment. And then you have, it's so odd, the Pahlavi era, which was one of secularization. And so now so much of the prejudice disappears and people start assimilating, and they become less and less interested in the traditions. revolution comes and people think this is the end of us. We're done. You know, the Jews, the Christians are all fleeing the country. But those small communities that persisted underwent an incredible revitalization under the Islamization of Iran in terms of institutions. The change is so remarkable to see what's going on. And so I think that, you know, we have many different forces are involved in it, but often unpredictable ones.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to go back to Dr. Karsiantia and invite him to give us some closing comments and reflections and prayers. Kersi, are you able to join us now? Oh. I think we've lost Kersi. As best as I can.
Uncle, you're on mute.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
I will start with the Gothic phrase. I think it's the last paragraph of the last, almost the last chapter, which is very relevant for our frashokarity and other issues raised by us today. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll start with the prayer from the Gathas, and then I will relate to that point by point. Mazda atmoi vahishta avenata sucha manangaha avarena vichitaya narem kakayai tanui paramazeyango maine sazdiyai bodanto paiti Mazda atmoi vahishta Savaocha shotnacha vocha Tatu vohu manangaha Asacha ishudim stuto Smaka shatra ahura Fereshem vasna Aitim dawo O Mazda, give us the best of words, the best of advice, the best of thoughts, so that we can carry out what you are wanting us to do. And give us the Vahumana, the good mind, and Shatra, the power to do that, so that Fereshem Vasna, we can bring about the frashokarity and our wish vasana for carrying out frashokarity as best as we can. This is just a mere summary, but it says a lot about how much frashokarity is our ideal and our goal, our ultimate goal. And the different speakers have brought it out well. I wish we had heard Jeanette's full story, but I am very familiar with everything she has written. I have read everything I could lay my hands on, and I really think that we should read that. I was in touch with so many Iranians, but one after another, they all have passed away. And I have very little information about Iran. But I get a lot of it from Janet's writings and books. And I really enjoyed it too from my own personal point of view, because she wrote about Morbid Shahzadi. That was my senior in school, and his brother was a Morbid here, right in Meetup in Chicago. And I was very glad to hear what she wrote about him, and also about the Iranians there really being more forthright and brave, actually, than any other minority group to assert themselves against the new government there. And they are aware and conscious of their being the most original Iranians. And that was very good to know. And of course, so many other things that she has written that I think unless we read that, we won't be in touch with our other brethren in Iran. And I think we should really thank her. And God may give her more strength and more resources to carry out her work. Coming to Dr. Ted Good, I really was learning something new from him, though I have read Linkert from the time I was in high school. But his talk was about a kind of curve that I had written about, but it has a different meaning. And I think that was written during the post-Sasanian time, when we were going through real hard time. When I read what I have written a lot about Zoroastrians after the Arab victory, and I can't sleep when I read how much they have gone through. If I recite their story one after another, you won't be able to have and enjoy your lunch. So I would spare you that. But we must read what is written about the hardships of the Iranians, and Dinkard was written about that. Dr. Good talk about the Dinkard book third, and I just wrote a paper about Dinkard third on basis of what Kriyan Book and other scholars have written. But he has a different angle to it, and I think that's what supported the Zoroastrians. Just fight all the evil you can, cooperate with all the good people you can, and survive as best as you can. And that's the message of the Dinkard Book Third. And I hope that will inspire us to continue our tradition here and not give in to any pressures or any oppressions. And Professor Miguel Toledo's One on the Fire was something that I'm interested in as an Atraman, as a priest. The fires play a very important part, and he has brought out the non-ritual part of the fire. I have dealt most of the time with the spiritual aspect and the metaphysical aspect and allegorical aspect of fire. The fire represents our own inner essence, It represents God's essence in us. But we had a very good expression of non-ritual Western fires, and that was very enlightening. And I have always appreciated any literature on that subject, and we are very grateful for Professor Miguel Andre Toledo for having taken up the position at the university, and I hope he would guide us more and more, because we need that. We have nobody anymore now that is knowledgeable among us. It's so sad that the only source of really educated Morbits was the Karma Institute, but it has closed down now for a long time. So we do depend upon people like him to educate us, and I hope he will be around us, and I hope we can help him and he can help us as much as possible. Thank you, Doctor. And then I come to my dear friend, Dr. Palsetia. I was really in love with his book. First book he wrote about the Parsi Panchayat. I wrote a book review, and he really appreciated it. He said he liked it. And his history raised so many questions that I would rather not go in detail, but I would like to meet with him and discuss many, many things. Like, I know that Dini Prakash has ended, but one of my teachers, J.C. Katrak, was in Parsi Panchayat doing something like that. And I wonder if there is anyone still in Parsi Panchayat doing and continuing that work of keeping our history intact. I think history is very important. All those who don't know their history are doomed to their own failures. So, and I also wonder what Dr. Palsetia thinks about books like, say, like Tanya Lerman. All the opinions that I have read about it was not very positive. They had found problems with it, and like it was a very narrow kind of research. It didn't include different opinions. It was only like one-sided, mostly naysayers like that. So I wonder what he thinks about that. I would like to see him personally and talk more about that. There are many other issues I don't know. First comes to mind, I haven't written down, but first comes to mind about 16 slokas. I wonder if there is any history at all to that. I have written about that. All my writings, by the way, are on avesta.org. Avesta, Avesta, avesta.org, under my title. It may be like 50, 60, 70 different subjects. It's like one man's research by one man's resources. So they are not that good like when you are employed by some organization or even Anchorage or help in any way by the institutions. So please bear with any inadequacies, but I have done my best about that. And I think that we need to rewrite and all our history. I was doing the research on Sogdians who are who lived in the West Eastern Iranian, and they were doing all the business with China, and China was very fond of the silk ropes, and the Iranians, the Sasanians, had captured the silk trade, and they would not let the Romans capture the trade. The Romans had hired Abyssinians and others, but we had hired the Yamanis, and the Yamanis would go all the way to Sri Lanka, where China sent the ropes, and Iranians will go from India, possibly Sanjan, to Sri Lanka, and capture. Not even once the Roman envoys were able to capture the trade. And I think that was the reason the Parsis had settled, and they settled only on the western coast. They were not anywhere else. This is a subject that really needs exploding, and we need people like Dr. Palsetia to carry it on and go more into that. There are many other subjects, but I don't want to stand between your lunch and that. And I appreciate all your attendance and attention, and hope and pray you will benefit from these different activities. And I will end with all the best wishes to all of you, and a big thanks for coming. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. That wraps up our morning session, unless there's anyone else who has any closing comments. So as you can see on the shared screen, that we will continue streaming on the same Zoom link that you have, starting at 2 o'clock this afternoon Central Time, Chicago time. Of course, we know that that's going to be late for many of those in other parts of the world, but I believe that there will be a recording available of all of the sessions, the morning sessions and the afternoon sessions, that will be made available by the SSZ. So with that, we will pause now and perhaps rejoin with some of you at 2 p.m. Chicago time. Thanks again to all of the speakers, all the panelists, and for you for attending this session today.
Thank you, everybody.